The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled, but the energy in the room wasn't tense with uncertainty. It was thick with arrogance. On the defendant's side, three uniformed men sat comfortably in their chairs, exuding confidence. Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis. Three white cops who had walked free too many times before. Their faces wore smirks instead of worry. They leaned back, whispering among themselves, exchanging nods, certain of the outcome. Their attorney, a high-profile defense lawyer known for getting law enforcement off the hook, sat beside them with a satisfied look. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The court has reviewed the presented evidence, and after careful consideration, silence. A brief pause before the inevitable. Mute, this case is dismissed. A sharp sound of the gavel echoed through the room. Cheers erupted from the officer's side. Mike clapped Greg on the back, a triumphant grin on his face. "Another day, another win," he said smugly. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, they really thought they could take us down." Tom stretched his arms, sighing like he had just wrapped up a long day at work. "I swear this job keeps getting easier. They bring us in, we put on a little show, and then, boom, we're out. Just like that." The courtroom wasn't just filled with their supporters. On the other side, families of victims sat in stunned silence. Black mothers, fathers, and community members who had fought for justice watched helplessly as it slipped through their fingers. Again. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their fists, but none of it mattered. The system had spoken. Mike stood up first, adjusting his police badge with a smug grin. "Well, gentlemen," he said, turning to his partners, "who's buying drinks tonight?" Greg laughed. "On me! We deserve it!" Tom ran a hand through his hair. "Damn, I love this job." Then it happened. The courtroom doors swung open with force. The heavy wooden panels slammed against the walls, silencing the laughter. The officers turned toward the entrance, their amusement freezing on their faces. A man walked in. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding the room without a single word. His sharp brown eyes scanned the courtroom with an intensity that sent a wave of unease through the officers. A neatly trimmed beard framed his strong jawline, and the way he carried himself, calm, in control, felt dangerously unfamiliar to them. But it wasn't just his presence that rattled them. It was who he was. Mike's grin faded. Greg shifted in his stance. Tom swallowed hard. Their world had just changed, and they could feel it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Mike, Greg, and Tom stood frozen, their bodies tense, their minds scrambling to process what they were seeing. The man they had once humiliated, beaten, and nearly destroyed now stood before them, exuding power, authority, and something far more terrifying. Control. Flashback. 5 years ago. The city was no stranger to police corruption, but few officers wore their abuse of power as a badge of honor, quite like Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis. A routine stop. That's what they called it. The black community called it something else. A hunt. For years, these officers had perfected their game. They knew the system, and they knew how to break a man without ever leaving a mark that couldn't be justified. A traffic stop could turn into an arrest. An arrest could turn into a fabricated charge. A fabricated charge could turn into a life ruin. And the system would back them every time. Their favorite targets, young black men with potential? Make an example out of one, and the rest will stay in line, Mike used to say. One night, Jamal Brooks became their next target. He had just finished his late shift at the bar he worked at, saving money for law school. He was on his way home when he saw the flashing red and blue lights behind him. He pulled over, hands on the wheel, no sudden movements. He had seen this play out before. Mike, Greg, and Tom stepped out of their squad car, their faces unreadable except for the faint smirks they always carried. "Step out of the car." Jamal complied. They asked him where he was going. They asked him why he was out so late. They asked him if he had anything in his car that shouldn't be there. Then Greg found something. A small bag of white powder. Planted. Jamal's heart pounded. "That's not mine," he said, his voice steady but firm. Mike grinned. "Oh yeah, then how'd it get here?" Jamal knew the drill. He had seen it happen to others. He knew that if he resisted, things would only get worse. But what he didn't know was that they weren't done yet. Tom suddenly grabbed him, slammed him face first against the hood of his car. Jamal winced, feeling the cold metal against his cheek. "Don't fight," he told himself. "Just survive." Crack! A sharp, intentional blow to his ribs. Greg leaned down, whispering in his ear, "You're done, kid. No school, no future. Just another thug behind bars." They booked him for possession with intent to distribute, a felony, a charge that would destroy his future. But fate had other plans. The case against Jamal should have been airtight, but something unexpected happened. A witness came forward. An old man who had been sitting on his porch that night saw everything. He had recorded the entire incident on his phone. For the first time in years, Mike, Greg, and Tom's own game turned against them. Jamal walked free. The case was dismissed. The officers, however, faced no consequences. No suspensions, no terminations, not even a slap on the wrist. The department protected them, buried the evidence, and let them keep their badges. But Jamal never forgot. And now the tables had turned. Back in the courtroom, he stood tall, watching the three men who had once tried to bury him. Mike clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Greg's hands curled into fists. Tom's breath grew unsteady. They weren't untouchable anymore. Jamal had returned, and this time he had all the power. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis, once the loudest voices in the room, were now silent. Their smirks had vanished, their confidence shattered. The man standing before them wasn't just an old victim resurfacing from the past. He was now their boss. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. "Before we conclude today's proceedings, I have an important announcement regarding the city's police leadership." A hush fell over the courtroom. "As of today," the judge continued, "this department will be under new leadership. Please welcome the newly appointed Chief of Police, Jamal Brooks." Whispers filled the room. The black community members exchanged looks of hope, some even gasping in disbelief. Meanwhile, the officers' section of the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Jamal stepped forward, his posture commanding respect. His dark brown eyes locked onto the three men who had once mocked, beaten, and framed him. "Officers Reynolds, Carter, and Willis." Jamal's voice was calm, but there was an undeniable weight behind it. Mike forced a smirk, though his face twitched with unease. "This some kind of joke?" Jamal tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Greg shifted in his seat. "Listen, we had nothing to do with any of that stuff. If you think you're gonna—" Jamal held up a hand, silencing him. "You had nothing to do with it?" A slow, deliberate pause. Then he pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the judge's bench. The courtroom fell silent again. "What you see here," Jamal said, "is a detailed record of every complaint, every abuse, and every corrupt act committed by Officers Reynolds, Carter, and Willis over the past decade." Mike's throat went dry. Greg wiped his palms on his uniform. Tom clenched his fists under the table. Jamal flipped open the first page. March 17th, 2016. False evidence planted on an 18-year-old black student. That charge ruined his college application. The footage? Mysteriously lost. Flip. August 5th, 2018. A traffic stop. The driver was unarmed. You claimed he resisted. Body cam footage was deleted. The bruises told a different story. Flip. September 2nd, 2020. Excessive force against a black store owner. Charges were dropped after the victim mysteriously withdrew his statement. You visited his house the night before? Flip. The room grew colder with every revelation. Greg finally snapped. This is bulls. Sit down, Jamal ordered, his voice sharp, a voice of authority. Greg froze. Jamal let the weight of silence crush them before he continued. I have statements, witnesses, documents. Evidence that was buried is now in my hands. He leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Your time of hiding behind this badge is over. Tom swallowed hard, his mind racing for an escape. Chief Brooks, listen. We were just doing our jobs. Jamal let out a slow exhale. Doing your jobs? He tapped the folder. If this is what you call doing your jobs, then you're not police officers. You're criminals in uniform. Mike's jaw tensed. You think you can just walk in here and take us down? Jamal smirked. No, Mike, I don't think. I know. The three officers felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just some empty threat. This wasn't just a headline case that would fade. This was real. Jamal was real. And now he had the power to bring them down. Mike Reynolds sat stiffly at his desk, his fingers gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Greg Carter scrolled through his phone, his leg bouncing uncontrollably under the table. Tom Willis stood near the window, arms crossed, staring blankly at the street below. None of them spoke. For the first time in years, they felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The precinct, once their kingdom, now felt like a trap closing in on them. The whispers had started the moment they walked in that morning. Did you hear? Internal Affairs is all over this. Man, if half of what they're saying is true, those three are finished. Officers they had once commanded respect from now exchanged glances behind their backs. The rookies who used to fear them no longer moved out of their way. The old-timers who had once covered for them now kept their distance. And worst of all, Jamal Brooks hadn't said a word to them. No threats, no warnings, no private confrontations. Just silence. And that silence was driving them insane. It had only been 48 hours since Jamal Brooks took over as chief of police, and already the walls were closing in. A citywide internal investigation had been launched into police misconduct. And at the top of the list, Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis. Mike slammed his fist on the desk. This is a damn witch hunt? Greg wiped sweat from his forehead. We need to figure out what the hell's going on. We need to talk to someone higher up, someone who can shut this down. Tom finally turned from the window. Shut this down? His voice was cold. Are you stupid? This isn't some low-level complaint we can make disappear. This is internal affairs. They're looking at everything. And they were. Investigators were pulling old case files, body cam footage, complaint reports. Every accidentally deleted piece of evidence was being recovered. Witnesses who had once been too scared to speak up were now stepping forward. And Jamal, he was letting it all unfold. No personal statements, no press conferences, no hints of revenge. Just letting the system do what it was supposed to do. And that terrified them. The three officers gathered in the break room, keeping their voices low. Brooks is setting us up, Mike muttered, his jaw clenched. How? Greg whispered. He's not even saying anything. He's just watching. Tom leaned in, lowering his voice further. That's what makes it worse. They had expected Jamal to come after them personally. Maybe a confrontation, maybe a public humiliation, maybe even a bogus charge to get back at them. But instead, he was letting the system do the work. And the system was finally turning against them. Mike exhaled sharply. We need to get ahead of this. Talk to Captain Harris. See if he can stall things. Greg's phone buzzed. A text. He glanced down and felt his stomach drop. Be in Internal Affairs at 3 p.m. We have some questions. Chief Brooks. He looked up at the others. It's starting. For the first time in their careers, they were the ones being hunted. The air inside the courtroom was different this time. Last time, Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis had walked in as untouchable men, grinning, celebrating their so-called victory. Today, they walked in as defendants. No arrogance, no smirks, no whispered jokes. Just fear. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, the media lined the walls, cameras rolling, ready to capture the downfall of three once powerful officers. The front rows were filled with members of the Black community, families of victims, activists, people who had suffered under the very men now sitting at the defendant's table. Mike adjusted his tie, but his hands were slick with sweat. Greg glanced around, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Tom clenched his fists under the table, trying to control his breathing. They could feel it. They were losing. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Williams, stood confidently, stacking her files on the table. Across from her, Jamal Brooks sat with the prosecution team. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for justice. Angela rose from her seat. Your Honor, today we present undeniable proof that Officers Reynolds, Carter, and Willis systematically abused their power, falsified reports, planted evidence, and engaged in racial discrimination for years. She turned to face the jury. The evidence against these men is overwhelming, and today, for the first time, they will answer for their crimes. Mike swallowed hard. This wasn't like before. They had always counted on missing evidence. They had always counted on scared witnesses. They had always counted on the system protecting them. Not this time. Angela walked to the evidence table and picked up a stack of old police reports. These are complaints filed against the defendants over the past 10 years, she said. 56 complaints of excessive force, 32 reports of illegal searches, 17 cases of false charges against innocent civilians, most of them Black men. She placed them down with a loud thud. The jury shifted in their seats. Greg ran a hand over his face, his heart hammering. 56 complaints, 32 illegal searches, 17 false charges. And that was just the beginning. Angela turned toward the screen at the front of the courtroom. Your Honor, the prosecution will now present video evidence recovered from deleted body cam footage. Click. The screen lit up. The courtroom watched in silence as the truth played out before their eyes. Clip after clip showed the officers on duty, planting drugs in cars, laughing as they shoved innocent men into the back of police cruisers, fabricating reasons for brutal arrests. Gasps rippled through the room. The sound of a mother sobbing broke the silence as she saw footage of her son being beaten, evidence that had been buried until now. Greg gripped the edge of the table so tightly his fingers turned white. Tom closed his eyes. Mike's face was frozen in shock. They had gotten away with so much for so long, but now it was all out in the open. The courtroom door opened, and a man walked in, an elderly Black man with a cane. Angela smiled. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Mr. Samuel Green to the stand. Mike's stomach dropped. He remembered that name. Years ago, they had threatened this man to keep his mouth shut when he had caught them planting evidence. But now, he was about to testify against them. Samuel took a deep breath and turned to the jury. I watched these men ruin lives. I watched them turn innocent people into criminals, and I was too scared to speak. But not anymore. His voice trembled, but his words were strong. These men don't deserve their badges. They deserve to be in prison. The final nail in the coffin. Greg's head dropped into his hands. Tom let out a slow exhale, knowing it was over. Mike just stared at the table, his face blank. They had walked into this courtroom thinking they could escape one last time. But today, for the first time, there was no way out. The jury had been dismissed for deliberation. Mike, Greg, and Tom sat at the defense table, their bodies stiff, their faces blank. An hour had never felt so long. They weren't talking anymore. No whispers, no strategizing, no arrogant smirks. Just waiting. The courtroom remained packed, the energy in the room electric, the media, the victims, the activists. Everyone was here to witness what should have happened years ago. Then, the doors creaked open. The jury had returned. The courtroom fell silent as the judge turned to the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? A deep breath, a glance at the paper in his hands, and then the words that would change everything. We have, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreman looked up, clearing his throat. On the charge of misconduct, guilty. On the charge of falsifying evidence, guilty. On the charge of excessive force, guilty. On the charge of racial discrimination, guilty. And then the final blow. On all counts, guilty, the courtroom erupted. Cheers, clapping. Some people even cried, tears of relief, of long-awaited justice. Jamal Brooks remained seated, watching the three men as they finally realized it was over. Mike's jaw clenched so tightly his entire face turned red. Greg's hands trembled as he gripped the table. Tom sat motionless, staring at nothing, his mind completely blank. The same system that had once protected them had now turned against them. The judge raised his gavel, silencing the courtroom. Due to the overwhelming evidence against the defendants, this court has no choice but to impose the maximum penalty permitted by law. Mike tensed. Greg swallowed hard. Tom's breathing grew unsteady. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, effective immediately. Boom! The gavel slammed down. The officers flinched at the sound. It was real now. A pair of U.S. Marshals stepped forward, their handcuffs glinting under the courtroom lights. Mike tried to speak, but no words came out. Greg's eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who might still have the power to save them. Tom closed his eyes, inhaling shakily, accepting the inevitable. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned back to them, his expression even colder. Furthermore, this court finds that the defendants have personally profited from years of corruption through illegal fines, fabricated charges, and stolen evidence. As part of their sentence, all financial assets obtained through these corrupt means are to be seized and redistributed to the victims and families affected by their actions. Mike's eyes widened. What? Your homes, your savings, your pensions, everything. Greg's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Tom exhaled sharply, finally realizing they weren't just losing their freedom, they were losing everything. As the officers were handcuffed and led away, the cameras flashed, capturing every moment. Mike sneered, leaning toward Jamal as he passed. Enjoy this while you can. We'll be back. Jamal, calm and unshaken, met his gaze. No, you won't. The doors slammed shut behind them. And just like that, their reign of corruption was over. The prison transport van rumbled down the road, its steel bars clanking with every bump. Inside, Mike Reynolds, Greg Carter, and Tom Willis sat in silence, their orange jumpsuits a sharp contrast to the crisp uniforms they once wore. No more badges, no more power, no more protection. Just convicts on their way to a maximum security prison. Mike stared at his reflection in the metal wall of the van, his fists clenched. How did it all go so wrong? Greg sat beside him, his mind racing. Who betrayed them? Who flipped? Tom simply closed his eyes. It was over. Outside the van, the world was watching. News stations played the footage over and over. Breaking news. 3 corrupt officers sentenced in historic trial. Former cops lose everything as victims finally get justice. Public celebrations erupt across the city following guilty verdict. The people had won. Outside the courthouse, a massive crowd had gathered. Reporters, activists, and community leaders stood in front of a podium, waiting for one man to speak. Jamal Brooks stepped forward. Flashes from cameras lit up his face. The microphones were shoved toward him, reporters shouting questions. But Jamal raised a hand. The crowd fell silent. He took a deep breath, looked directly into the cameras, and spoke. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The crowd erupted into cheers. Jamal continued, his voice steady. For too long, corruption has poisoned our system, but today we proved that no badge, no position, and no amount of power can shield criminals from justice. People clapped, some even crying. This is just the beginning, Jamal said. Because corruption won't last forever. The crowd roared. It was a victory. A moment in history. But as Jamal stepped away from the podium, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Meanwhile, in a sleek, dimly lit office overlooking the city, a man in a sharp suit watched the broadcast. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the glass of whiskey in his hand tightened. He exhaled, shaking his head as he picked up his phone. Dialed a number. The line rang once before a voice answered. It's time. The man took a slow sip of his drink, watching Jamal's face on the screen. He's becoming a problem. Click. The call ended. Outside, the city celebrated. Inside, a new enemy was already making his move. To be continued.